Professor Chris Landsberg from the University of Johannesburg still with us, and joined now by someone who's been following our politics for years and years. In fact, great honour to hear from him again. Professor Xolela Mangcu, now at George Washington University in the United States. Professor Mangcu, good afternoon to you. It's been a while since we last spoke to you. You leave us alone for 10 years, and the Democratic Alliance and the ANC are going into government together. Did you ever believe it would happen?
I'm happy to be back, and thanks for having me.
Are you surprised to see the ANC and the DA going into bed like this? I mean, do you think it's really going to work?
I'm not surprised at all, actually, and I think it's the best possible outcome, and I'll tell you why. For many years, we've been racking our brains as political analysts about what kind of institutional arrangements would be needed, right, to stem the decline in this country under the ANC majority government. What the South African people have done is that they have written the script for us. And it doesn't matter what ideological proclamations politicians make. The script has been written. I mean, for Mbalula, for example, to suggest that corruption is somehow a matter of perception or it's an image problem, it defies logic, given the results of the elections. What I'd like to see, though, is a discussion that takes us to what is really watershed about this moment. And that is, it's not just a matter of, resetting the decks on the Titanic. We need to think about how this is a reimagination of the model of democracy that we've had over the past 30 years. We need to go back to the drawing board, in other words, raise ourselves above, the nitty-gritties of what is happening now, and look at what does this mean for us as a society, constitutionally and politically going forward. And to me, it does seem like it's a new age. It's a new age. It's a transition from the majoritarian era that has been the history of liberation movements for decades to a multipartism that has been practiced in many other parts of the world. So there's something about this that tells us that we need to reconfigure our constitutional and political arrangements.
Professor Landsberg, you're listening to this, and I mean, is it a multi-partism, or is one party going in this coalition to try and win it, to try and swallow the other?
Greetings, my friend. Long time no see. Hope you enjoying the land of the living.
Yeah, good to hear from you.
So I agree with Professor Mangcu. I tell you what though is disappointing. For me, where I agree with him, it's not so much the ideological differences between the parties that brought the schisms between some who can't stand each other right now. Not so long ago, Prof. Mangcu, I put it to you that the DA and the EFF were in alliances at local government and metro levels to oppose the ANC. And for me, the tragic thing is that it's not ideological differences. It's not policy differences, and we harp too much on the differences as opposed to what they have in common. It's tragic how ego and personality clashes and differences and insults at one another have also played out. If you would ask the ANC, I hazard a guess, they would have loved a broader church, and I also predict the names that are there right now, by next week, a few more will be joined. And I think why I'm saying that, Stephen, I think it's going to dawn on the ANC that the members that are there right now, apart from the PA, are all former members of the Moonshot Pact, the multi-party pact, right? I think it could have been broadened to be more representative of broader society in order to present societal interests. Whether they will end up pursuing societal interests as opposed to narrow, selfish party political interests remains to be seen.
Professor Mangcu, I mean, multipartism, which I think is a new word that, I'm going to be thinking about for a long time. One of the things that's always worried me as part of this process when we talk about coalitions, and I know everyone talks about Germany and Europe, and frankly, I'm kind of sick of hearing about them because those are homogenous countries, economically speaking. We have racialized inequality, the worst inequality in the world. And that, for me, is always going to make it difficult for, let's kind of call it what it is, a sort of minority sort of representing a richer constituency, which is the DA, and a kind of majority representing a poorer constituency, which is the ANC, and of course race on top of that, to get together. And yet in under 14 days, they seem to have done it, which makes me wonder if we're actually just storing up trouble for later.
Not necessarily. I mean, I think that what you've just described is a metaphor for actually how you get those two sides of the class divide and the racial divide in this country in conversation with each other. And there's going to have to be a whole lot of bargaining. There's this canard that is being thrown around all the time, that the DA is going to bring us back to apartheid or, I mean, come on, right? It's just, white people are just like so numerically small and so, the whole thing is just, as I say, a canard. But what needs to happen, in my opinion, is that getting the DA and the ANC and whoever comes into that into a room where they can come to some, working agreement about how actually to address these issues instead of shouting at each other from, across the divide. I agree with Chris that that this antipathy, this personal antipathy between leaders of political parties is downright destructive. It's Nelson Mandela once said that hate blinds leaders. It blinds them from the strategic decisions that have to be made. And if we can, as a society, get to that place where we look at things strategically for the country. I mean, for me, it can only bode well for the country. It is also an opportunity, quite frankly, for a political realignment between, let's say, the moderates, all right, the ANC, the DA, the IFP, let's say, on one hand, and the radicals, the communists, the EFF, and MK, right? Let that political realignment happen, and then let the people of South Africa decide which part, right, which side they want to go with. South Africa has long been overdue for a political realignment of that kind.
So just to come in there, Xolela, for me, the fundamental point that you've made and also emphasized by Stephen, almost reinforced by the question by Stephen, right, is that will we see these changes in behavior? Will we see a willingness to compromise? So, for example, the one is a proponent in foreign policy of a quote-unquote progressive internationalism, whereas the other one is without a doubt unashamedly aligned to the Western liberal order, right? But something good can come out of that the DA could help South Africa to reconnect to the West, because in recent years a distance have emerged. But here's the question for me, Prof. Xolela. It's not that multipartyism has finally arrived and the ANC finds itself in shock. It's in entering a government to rule together. It's a process. It should be the outcome of a process. It's almost like we've rushed into this thing. And whatever nature this government of national unity was going to take, nature and shape, and however many players were going to be involved, it's the outcome of a process. You don't declare yourself a government of national unity and go figure out the details later. And that is one of the problems. For example, to take a rule from the 1993 Constitution, Prof. Mangcu, there was a very clear principle on sufficient consensus, and minority parties would be allowed to disagree with the dominant party, right? Will that principle be upheld? Because the ANC could find itself being outvoted on a number of questions. Let me take the case of the Gaza-Israel war, for example. What will it be? We still don't know what those principles are by which they will take decisions on the basis of sufficient consensus.
Professor Mangcu, I mean, this is the issue, isn't it? There's a lot still to be worked out.
So, of course, there's a lot. You know, Chris and I used to work together at the Center for Policy Studies back in the 1990s, late 90s.
When you tried to take my job.
And early 2000s. So, you know, and I'm reminded of the intellectual creativity of that period as people were searching for ideas. So if there's one wish that I have, is if we can recapture some of that intellectual fervor so that what is happening in the political sphere is mirrored in the intellectual sphere, where ideas are continually generated, right, and fed into the political system. In my view, what really needs to happen, we need to go back to a rethinking of the Constitution. We may even have to have now another constitutional convention to address the issues that Chris is talking about. You know, sufficient consensus, what majorities are required. You know, so that we have a longer term to avoid continual crises and fights and disputes. This has to be put on a firmer constitutional political footing. Otherwise, we'll find ourselves, as you guys are saying, in these short-term arrangements that are prone to break up at one time or another.
Professor Xolela Mangcu, now a professor at George Washington University, with us in our studio. Professor Chris Landsberg from the University of Johannesburg with us here as well. Professor Mangcu, I should say, is actually not in our studio, but Professor Landsberg is. Geography has always been a problem for me. Just to update you on where we are in the vote for a National Assembly Speaker. As you know, Xolela Diza nominated by the African National Congress. And then from the EFF, Veronica Mente has been nominated. At the moment, the MPs, the members of the National Assembly who have been sworn in, so all of the MPs apart from those who represent Umkhonto weSizwe, have now voted. The votes are currently being counted. The EFF objected to the way in which the counting was going to be processed, and as a result of that, observers from each of the parties, so one member from each of the parties, has now gone into the counting chamber to go and count the votes together. Or to observe the counting, rather. We await the result of that election between Xolela Diza and Veronica Mente for the position of Speaker of the National Assembly. Just to update you on the situation in some of the provincial legislatures as well. In Northwest, Premier Lazarus Mokhotsi has now been elected. In Gauteng, Panyaza Lesufi has been re-elected Premier unopposed, proposed by the ANC, seconded by the Democratic Alliance. In KwaZulu-Natal, it appears that the coalition agreement involving the IFP, the ANC, the DA and the National Freedom Party is working there. Now, let's update you on what's probably the main story of the day. The ANC and the Democratic Alliance have agreed to work together in a government of national unity after the two parties signed a collaborative agreement at the Cape Town International Convention Centre, where Parliament is meeting this afternoon. DA leader John Steenhuisen said the party's partnership with the ANC will ensure that the voices of DA voters will be heard in the rooms where decisions about the country are being made.
From today, the DA will co-govern the Republic of South Africa in a spirit of unity and collaboration. The DA takes this historic step forward out of our deep and abiding love for the people of this country. We do so both for the millions of people who voted for us and for all South Africans who yearn for a better government and a brighter future.
Professor Chris Landsberg with us, Professor Xolela Mangcu with us as well. Professor Landsberg, afternoon to you again. I mean, in a way, and I think the ANC is going to do this as well, John Steenhuisen telling his voters, this is why I'm working with the party that we campaigned against. And this is going to be something the ANC will have to do too. They'll have to tell their voters why they're now working with the party they campaigned against.
Not only that, he made the statement that the voices of the DA voters will now be heard. Now, so many of the parties who voted predominantly by black voters, right, where poverty and joblessness and the social question is felt the deepest and the harshest. Who's going to speak on their behalf? It seems that it will have to happen from it will have to happen basically from the benches of the opposition. I still say it's regrettable that personality quibbles and insults got us to this point. It could have been a broader church, but we also have to address the issue of accountability and who will hold, who will guard the guardians.
Professor Mangcu, doesn't this bring us to another point, which is that the people who voted for MK and the people who voted for the EFF and some of the smaller parties, but for a moment, if we can concentrate on MK and EFF, it's nearly a quarter of the electorate. Yeah. And they are not included in this, and they are not going to feel any more included over 5 years unless policies are deliberately directed towards them to improve their lives. And unfortunately, due to the nature of our society, their anger might only grow, quite legitimately so.
That's why it's a misnomer. It's a misnomer, and to describe this as a government of national unity, because if it was, then you would have had those parties in the government, right? But I do want to say that multipartyism itself does not mean the end of political division, right? But the idea is that you can, right, go on the hustings and you can campaign for your positions. And depending on the outcomes, right, you would form a workable government, because at the end of the day, you need to do that. I do think that it is correct to say that people who voted for MK and the EFF will not be part of this. But then that's why we have elections, right? So that come the next elections, they can say the ANC and the DA failed to deliver, and we want the South African public to vote for MK and EFF. I mean, in other words, the electorate has charted the path for a political realignment by the way they voted. And you will, as you know, with each election, look at those results within the context of a new constitutional framework, I believe, form governments. But there will always be that political contestation.
Well, let's hear from the political party which did not arrive today, Umkhonto we Sizwe, their spokesperson, Xolela, explaining why they decided not to come today.
Well, those are key theatrics on the side of the Secretary of Parliament. We made it clear, the whole nation knows that Umkhonto we Sizwe, his intent was not to attend and therefore boycott and protest the sitting of the National Assembly. So as to how all of a sudden there's 5 names that are seemingly confirmed is baffling in of itself. We are aware that there are rules, and we are working within the rules of the law and the protocols of Parliament. We are concerned that this National Assembly sitting is unconstitutional because it's not a true reflection, of what ought to have been the outcome of those results, including the fact that the IEC declared those results in the backdrop of objections that had not been considered and concluded. And the IEC then going ahead and saying the purpose of them rushing to make this announcement was to satisfy markets, which is baffling in of itself, because the IEC's responsibility is to ensure free and fair elections, of which these are not. They're a sham, they're a fraud, and we cannot be, in effect, condoning or being associated with a sitting that is reflected of, a sham of an election.
Xolela, the spokesperson for Mangcu, the one political party which did not come to the sitting of the National Assembly today. Professor Chris Landsberg, Professor Xolela Mangcu still with me. Professor Landsberg, I have to make the obvious and slightly boring journalistic point, which is fine to say we're not coming to the National Assembly because we don't respect the results of the elections, because we dispute them. But then why would they go to the sittings of the provincial legislatures?
No, but apart from that, Stephen, I mean, I hope the next thing we won't hear from MKP is that the judiciary is against them. I mean, they've won quite a remarkable set of cases recently in a litigious, obsessed political culture in our country. To conflate the IEC issue with representation in today's National Assembly is quite unfortunate. They could have made a huge difference today as a member outside of this alliance. Just one point, Stephen, and I would like Xolela to react to that. When Ibrahim Fakir and I wrote that piece in favor of a government of national unity, we did so on the premise that this country faces serious economic, social, political crises. I mean, there's almost a return, Prof. Mangcu, of tribalism, not just on the part of Jacob Zuma. And I think President Zuma almost is like sort of the bogeyman on that issue. But all of a sudden, racial divisions and the race issue is back. And we seem to have moved away from the values of the Constitution rather than towards it. And it's the ANC who was in government and had the majority that should take responsibility for that. We made the case precisely because we need more unity, not disunity and fragmentation in our society.
Professor Mangcu, I mean, it's quite something to have MPs being elected and not show up. I can think of several cases where it's happened. I think it might have happened in Britain when people from an Irish party refused to swear allegiance to the Queen. That held things up for a while. But still in this case, I mean, it's a large number of votes that aren't being heard today. Sure, the MK has the right to do this, but I don't know if it was the right moral or the right strategic decision.
It goes back to the whole discussion we were having earlier about personalities and individual leaders, the way they conduct themselves, and whether it is in the interest of their followers or it is just about themselves. Now, you know, how the MK party conducts itself. I mean, what's really heartening about this election is how ordinary folks from across this land have made judgment on how politicians conduct themselves. And they are looking at a party like MK and they are saying, really? Like, you want to be the people who govern this country and you're conducting yourselves in this particular way. In other words, sometimes, right, it's not about the technicalities, but it's about what you represent, the symbolism of your actions. I don't think that the MK party has acquitted itself well on that score. One other thing I want to make, and I've made this for like decades now, this country, needs to pay serious attention to the intellectual dimension of things. Somehow, we speak about the political and the economic, but we need to find a forum, an institution, a center where people from across political parties can discuss ideas, whether these are ideas about foreign policy or economic policy, because political parties by nature, by design, by, throughout history, have always had a limited conception of society. And they've always, of course, also have been self-serving. We need to find institutional avenues, institutional forums where we don't leave our fate only to the political parties and the shenanigans of their leaders. But you can have a space where ideas are generally brought, canvassed, and they feed into the political system. That's at least one thing that Steve Biko once argued for.
There's such a big argument there. Just to update you on the situation in the National Assembly as we await the result of the election for a new Speaker of the National Assembly. The bells are ringing. What that means is not that break is over, but in fact that MPs do have to go back to the National Assembly to hear the announcement. Normally, the bells ringing gives you about 10 minutes notice, so we expect that we should get an announcement on this fairly soon. And as you can see, the class is in, but no one's taken their seats yet because the teacher is still to be announced. So we'll just watch that process as it plays out. Malusi Gigaba there, I wonder how, if he were in an ANC cabinet, how John Steenhuisen would feel about being in a cabinet with him. And Professor Landsberg, doesn't that get to the heart of some of the problems that we're seeing?
Absolutely. But Stephen, just to correct you, so the bell did ring for them to go back into class. All right. I mean, but... So let me introduce an issue, and Ria, I'm really interested to hear Prof. Mangcu's point, and I don't think I've heard this issue being discussed yet. Now let me use the analogy of this important oath that people took today, the parliamentarians, Prof. Mangcu. They swore allegiance to the constitution of this country, not of Zimbabwe or Venezuela or some other countries. Here is a question. To what extent are there foreign influences and forces that have gotten some parties to the point that they could not become flexible because they promise? So let me use two examples to be nuanced and fair. On the ANC side, BRICS members, Russia and the like were their influences. But the real question I have, to what extent is the DA's position, right, to really try and keep some parties out, part of a deal that was also struck by a very, very powerful country, and Prof. Mangcu just happened to sit in the capital of that country right now.
Professor Mangcu, I mean, doesn't it go both ways? I mean, people have been talking about Russian money going to the ANC for years.
I am so glad Chris brought this up, because I don't understand why we have created an enemy out of the United States. Now, you can speak about the American government and how much, we can criticize the government for the horrible things, including its support for Israel and Gaza, right? But we cannot cede this territory of the United States and other Western countries to the DA. Quite frankly, they are the newcomers to our relationship with the United States and other Western countries. Black people have been at the core of that relationship since people like John Langalibale Dube went to study at Oberlin College, since there were relations with people like W.E.B. Du Bois and the ANC and the Pan-Africanist movement.